Hello, pattern readers, and welcome to a discussion of book-to-screen changes in Episode 5 of The Wheel of Time, Season 1. If you haven't read the books and need to avoid spoilers, you might want to go and check out a recent Episode 5 video I did, which discusses the episode and analyzes it without any book spoilers. But for this video, check the spoiler warning on the screen. I will specifically list how far into the books I'm going to spoil in this video. In addition to really digging into those book-to-screen changes, I'll bring in some of the foreshadowing and Easter eggs that are there for book readers to pick up on. And if you missed it, I did one of these kind of videos for Episode 4 as well, so go back and check that out. So let's talk about the decision to use the 1 month later device to get everyone to Tar Valon at around the same time and move the story forward. The downside to skipping ahead 1 month is that we kind of are left assuming that maybe not a lot happened in that 1 month time frame. And as book readers, we do kind of know that there should be some things happening. Like, we would expect that the shadow is still pursuing our characters, and most especially Rand and Mat, because Mat is carrying the Shadow Logain dagger. And in the books, he kept attracting dark friends and shadow spawn because of carrying that dagger. Now, of course, we can sort of assume that maybe they did have some encounters and they had to escape again. We don't get to see it. But overall, I think this decision works. It works well for an adaptation. We don't have an overabundance of travel scenes, because that does get wearing after a while and it starts to feel a little bit too much like Lord of the Rings, and it gets everyone to where we need them to be in Tar Valon without making it seem like they've just jumped across the continent. So I wanted to comment on a couple of little details as the characters are approaching Tar Valon. We see each group sees these stones with markings on them, and I think a lot of book fans were looking at those going, are those portal stones? However, they don't seem to be portal stones, because what is written on them is not symbols. What is written is in Old Tongue script. And there are some wonderful fans out there who are really good at looking at Old Tongue script and were able to sort of figure out what some of these mean. And they seem to be distance markers, letting us know like how far to Tar Valon and in other directions, other locations. And then Rand noticing Dragon Mount. They're playing up this mystery of who is the Dragon Reborn. They're trying to downplay Rand a little bit, so to not make that overly obvious. So far, the only other significant moment he's had is with busting through that door when he was running away from Dana. The fact that he recognizes Dragon Mount is certainly a pretty big clue that he is the Dragon Reborn, even though as an infant, he should not have a memory of being there. So it's possible that that recognition is coming through from past life memory seepage, like a tiny little bit of that beginning here. Another thing worth noting in regards to Rand is that we have not seen him be sick with channeling madness. Now, it could very well have occurred because they did do that 1 month time skip. We saw him channel in Breen Spring, presumably, and he did not have any kind of an effect immediately afterward. But that is fitting with the books, because we are told that like the first time you channel, the channeling sickness occurs with some gap of time, and then each time you channel, it occurs closer and closer. So it would make perfect sense. Some awesome little Easter eggs in the Tar Valon crowd scenes. Right before Mat and Rand go into the inn, we start to hear some whistling, and then we see, sort of watching them as they're walking in, a figure close to the camera, and we can't see their face, but we can figure out this is Podon Fane watching them go into the inn, so he knows where they're staying. Also, as book readers, we get our first clue that Mat is losing some of his memories because he can't recall what happened the night that the Grinwells were killed. He still doubts and questions whether he could have been the one to kill them, even though Rand has clearly told him repeatedly that that didn't happen, that both he and Tom saw what happened, and it was the Fade. Now, let's talk about the decision to make Tar Valon the location where our characters converge, as opposed to Caemlyn as it happens in the book. On the one hand, in The Eye of the World, as in the show, they were always heading towards Tar Valon. That was always the intention, and things got sidetracked in The Eye of the World, and they never make it there in book 1. But in terms of the impact on the story, it's an important thing to explore. By not including Caemlyn, What we're essentially missing out on is an introduction to Andoran politics. Now, I happen to think it's perfectly fine to delay introducing any kind of Andoran politics at this point. It isn't all that crucial to understand that in the story, and that's just an added element that might be a lot for people to keep track of. It's way more relevant to the early story and the story overall to understand White Tower politics. So we're sort of substituting. We're going to get to know more about White Tower politics instead of Andoran politics early on, and I think that is a good trade. The other thing that we miss out by not going to Caemlyn is meeting the Andoran royal family. We don't meet Elaine or Galad or Gawain or Morghese. We don't meet Elaida or Gareth Bryn or Talonvor. I mean, these are a lot of characters that we're introduced to in this one chapter in the Eye of the World. And quite frankly, that was always too many characters to meet when we're not going to see a lot of them again for a while. So that was never going to be all of those characters. But we don't get to meet any of them yet. Now, to be fair, if they had wanted to introduce some of these characters in Tar Valon, they could have. They could have expedited some of those characters going to Tar Valon, as many of them do, and they reach there in book 2. So we could have had Elaine and Gawain and Galad and Elaida in Tar Valon if they'd wanted to, but the show still opted not to introduce those characters yet. So it was definitely a deliberate choice, because moving things to Tar Valon does not automatically eliminate meeting those characters. So why might they have decided not to include them in season 1? It probably makes sense not to introduce all 4 of those characters, let's say. Elaida specifically, the main thing that she does in the Eye of the World is a foretelling about Rand. And that is a very telling moment where it does kind of reveal a lot, and it sort of takes away from some of the mystery that they are building in the show. So I definitely understand not introducing Elaida. We already probably have enough Aes Sedai characters to keep track of in this first season. Some people seem to be a little bit concerned about potentially combining Liandrin and Elaida as a character because of some commentary in this episode about Liandrin gaining some influence in the White Tower. So I agree that is an interesting line, and it does raise some questions about what Liandrin's role might be going forward. I personally very much dislike the idea of combining those two characters, because I think it is crucial for Elaida as a character that she not be a dark friend, that we can see a character who makes horrible mistakes and really does terrible things, believing she's doing right, but who is not connected to the shadow. And Liandrin is a dark friend, so unless they're going to change that about her character, it really doesn't make sense to combine these two characters to me. And I think there are better characters to combine. So for instance, it may work to combine Liandrin with Galena, or it may work to combine her with Alviarin even. And that could play into her gaining some influence, where maybe eventually she becomes Elaida's keeper of the chronicles and is sort of the true power behind Elaida. That could be an interesting twist. So why not introduce Elaine at least, or Gawain and Galad? Well, I don't know. That is a harder one to say. On the one hand, I would be thrilled to see these characters and to get an introduction to them. But maybe it is just a little bit, too many threads to handle at once. The one thing about it that I am very curious to see how they do handle it is, when is Rand going to meet those characters? I personally would love to have an opportunity for him to meet all of them because of their overall, significance in relationships to him. Elaine, of course, she's sort of obvious, unless they're radically changing that dynamic, they do need to meet at some point. And even though he actually has very little interaction overall with Gawain or Galad, they both kind of have significant feelings about Rand. Gawain ends up hating him for various not all that fantastic reasons, but it does make a difference if he's never met Rand as a character. And then Galad, of course, turns out to be Rand's half-brother, and that might be a little less significant if they've never met. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to work that in, and I would like to see that happen eventually. I don't mind spacing out character meetings and introductions so that each of them can get more significance in those moments. We've seen how that worked pretty well with Tom in this season. They delayed meeting him so that when we did meet him, he was able to get more focus. And yes, we did get less time with him, so it's a little bit of a trade-off. But in the end, if you get to meet a character in a memorable way and they get a little bit more focused, so it's not just kind of shoehorned into a tighter season, but it's a wait and see. Hopefully those will get some significant moments later on. Let's talk about Loial, because I wouldn't say that they made any real changes to him as a character, but there are definitely some design choices that people felt were different and some people had a hard time with. They didn't want to rely on any kind of VFX for the character of Loial. And the reason being that if you have a character that is reliant on VFX in every shot that they're in, it becomes very expensive. And then what often follows is that character then becomes underutilized because they don't want the expense of having to do so much special effects for the character every time they're on screen. So Rafe Judkins really framed this as a choice between either having less Loial or doing a Loial where we're not using VFX. So to me, I think the specific consequence of that is we don't have Ogier ears. And I think that is because that really would have relied on VFX to do that properly. And it might be a reason why they gave him such voluminous hair to sort of hide any ears that might be in there. That is disappointing, I will admit. I always loved Ogier ears, and I will miss that aspect of his expressiveness. Facially, I love that he doesn't look human. He looks like a different kind of person. He's not a human being. And I love that they were able to accomplish that. Yeah, he's shorter than Ogier are supposed to be. And I guess they just opted not to go that way. They certainly could not do what they did with the Trollocs for Loial to make them taller, because I think the consequence of that is the legs don't really look human-like, and I think that would not have worked for Loial as a character. They would have had to do more of a Lord of the Rings type approach, where they're always positioning people differently in relationship to the camera to show much taller and much shorter people. I don't know whether they considered doing that, but overall, I really can't complain about these choices for Loial, because the fact is they hired the right actor. They hired an actor who can bring forth the essence of this character, who can sound like the character, who can act through heavy prosthetics and really show us who this character is. And that makes it, so I'm happy to have that, and really glad that Hamid Anamashon is part of this cast and will be able to be utilized as much as they want to utilize him, because they weren't relying on expensive effects to create the character. In the library scene with Loial and Rand, we get to see both a copy of the Koreathon cycle, The Prophecies of the Dragon, so it makes sense that Rand might be drawn to that one, and The Travels of Jane Farstrider. A little bit noteworthy there is when he's talking about Jane Farstrider, he talks about how Egwene loved this book and that she sort of thought of herself as Jane herself reincarnated. So interesting, not really clear whether this is just referencing the idea that souls, when they're reincarnated, don't necessarily maintain the same gender, or if perhaps Jane Farstrider, if they become a character in the show, might be a woman instead. I can already feel some haters getting very upset about this. And then we have Loial mentioning many times how Rand looks like an Aielman, and he never really seems to believe that Rand is not an Aielman, despite Rand's insistence that he isn't. So that's also another pretty big clue for the viewers here as to what might be going on. So we're definitely getting a few more hints about Rand in this episode. When Rand and Mat see Logain, it's unclear whether he looks at them at all. He might look at them. I think he definitely does not do the mad laughter that Mat sees. That seems to be something that Mat alone is seeing. But I do like how that moment has been adapted. First of all, I'm very glad we got it. It was one of my favorite moments from the Caemlyn scenes. So the fact that we still get to see that is wonderful. And we get to see essentially what Rand saw in the Eye of the World. It's just more of a question of how much of it is real. By including Mat, it doesn't make the whole thing so much more obviously a tell about who Rand really is. The moment between Mat and Rand after is all the more poignant when you know that one of them will be able to channel. It's not the one who looks more likely now, it's not Mat, but it is Rand. And I can only hope that that pact that they've made to look out for each other will hold once Mat finds out that Rand can channel. One possible variation we can expect here then, because they have made the character of Matt himself question whether he can channel, that is a difference from the book. So he didn't have that reason to then feel any sort of sympathy towards Logain or any other man who can channel, specifically Rand. So that when he finds out Rand can channel, he's like, oh, get me away from him. Which is something that book readers have a really hard time with, how he reacts to his friend in that moment. So we might expect to see a difference here, because Matt, in this case, has more reason to have developed some sympathy for Rand. Now, I want to talk about what is probably, for many book readers, maybe the most controversial choice made in this episode. It's making Steppin a more significant character. And that is certainly increased in this episode. He was significant in episode 4, but even more of a focus in episode 5. By taking some of that screen time for Steppin, it might be taking away from some other screen time for things that they had wanted to see. You have to kind of look at the pros and cons of this. Let's look at the pros for starters. You have a very moving and effective, powerful way for the audience to really understand the consequences of a warder Aes Sedai bond when it is broken, when one party dies prematurely. We're seeing it from the perspective of an Aes Sedai dying and the effect that will have on her warder. This is truly significant for the characters of Moraine and Lan. And we can already see that here, because Lan is a close friend of Steppin. He has so many reasons to feel very powerfully for what happens to Steppin. But from Moraine's side of it, she is worried about Lan. She is worried about what might happen to him if she should be killed. And she has reason to worry about this, given the choices that she's making with her life to directly oppose the shadow. She's putting herself in immediate harm's way. So this isn't arbitrary on her part to be worried about this. So I think there's enormous benefits in understanding why Moraine might make the decision to pass Lan's bond to another Aes Sedai in the event of her death, and why she will have that conversation with Lan, and he'll be upset by it, but we as viewers might have a little bit more understanding of why she chooses to do this, because we've seen how it plays out with Steppin. By the way, it seems likely that Alana could end up playing the role that Morella plays in the books of being the one to hold Lan's bond after Moraine goes through the Redstone doorway at the end of book 5, because we're establishing more of that friendship between Moraine and Alana, and there are some similarities between the characters. Otherwise, I think you could very easily combine the two of them and have that work. This is also previewed by Alana offering to bond Steppin, and him not choosing to take her up on that offer, but we see that she is an Aes Sedai who is willing to take on a warder who might be in a very dangerous mindset because he has lost his Aes Sedai. Perhaps her not pushing Steppin to let her bond him, and the consequence of that could even factor into her decision to not wait for Rand to say yes and to just go ahead and bond him anyway. Obviously, that is a different scenario, and it does not justify her doing that because Rand was not in danger. But again, by showing the consequence of what happens to a warder when his Aes Sedai dies, you can also kind of flip that around. And in her case, she's going to be an Aes Sedai who loses her warder. And so we might have a little bit more understanding again for a character who is going through an intense grief and how that might make her do something extremely questionable. So all of that to say that I think this little storyline with Steppin is very effective just in its own right, and it very effectively sets up some major plot points that happen in the series that will help prime the audience for understanding those moments. So there's some real benefits to including that. I think if we're going to argue that the inclusion of Steppin is replacing anything from the book itself, you have to make the argument from the standpoint of, well, they took time to show this, and that screen time that they might have then decided to not show something else because they didn't have the screen time for it in only 8 episodes. So I think that's fair. I think you have to also consider that in any specific instance, there might be something that they chose to cut out for other reasons, not for time, but for practicality. So, for example, we know that with a limited number of locations, You can't effectively build an unlimited number of locations and have them all look great. If there were things that could have occurred in the show, but realistically could not occur in Tar Valon for some reason, then it's not a one-to-one trade-off, because you perhaps couldn't include that other thing because it needed to occur somewhere else. And that might be the reason why they cut it out. I missed seeing Bail Domon. That's something that I would have enjoyed seeing. I don't think you can reasonably argue that seeing Bail Domon in season 1 is more important and impactful overall than what they did with Steppin. So that, to me, if that's a time trade-off that they made, I'm okay with that. Another thing that I missed was not so much Elias specifically. I do miss Elias, but as I've talked about before, I understand why they didn't include Elias for other reasons in this season. I still hope he will come in later. But I did miss specifically the scene where Elias and Perrin and Egwene are running from the Ravens. That is something that didn't make it in, and it doesn't seem like it's going to come back later. I think it was great. I think it was cinematic. I would have loved to have seen it. I don't know that that is something that was cut just for time or for other reasons. Whatever it is, that's probably one of the things that I'll miss the most. But again, if it is a time trade-off, like, well, we just don't have time to do that because we're doing these other things, that was a cool scene. It was really evocative. I miss it. But I can also agree that what we got here is really important. And I would not want them, ultimately, my feeling is I would not want them to have cut out this Steppin plotline, now having seen it and being able to assess the impact that it's going to have overall on setting up future plot lines. I think it was a great choice. So let's talk about some of the changes that happen with Perrin and Egwene and the Whitecloaks, specifically Valda. So one of the changes here is that in comparison to the book, we're dealing with Aemon Valda instead of Jeffrey Bornhold. And that is a big difference because Jeffrey Bornhold, as we get to know him in the books, is the reasonable Whitecloak. You know, that's perhaps damning with faint praise, but nevertheless, he does maintain more of his reason and sanity. He's not as much of a fanatic as someone like Valda is. And he certainly doesn't seem to get off on torturing people the way Valda does. So Perrin and Egwene are in far more danger in Valda's hands than they would have been in Bornhold's. Another difference is they're not taken into Whitecloak custody because either of them actually did anything wrong. They literally didn't do anything. Valda just happened to come across them in his travels twice and decided, yep, that looks like an Aes Sedai and her warder, so I'm just going to take them. So there was a decision here to not have Perrin attack a Whitecloak. And there might be a couple reasons for this. Number one, we haven't been able to fully explore the bond with the wolves yet. We don't really understand what's happening. So it might have been rushing a little bit to try to have Perrin respond to the death of a wolf this early on, when we haven't had a chance to really build up that relationship. I, again, assume that is coming at some point. Whether we will get an exact scene like that at some point, I don't know, but we will have more of a chance to build up that relationship with the wolves, but it would have made less sense here. Plus, we've already had Perrin have a moment where he is in the thick of something and kills someone without really meaning to. So I can see why they wouldn't want to include him killing a Whitecloak just yet. And I think there's still opportunity for that to happen. I think that could very well happen in season 2, perhaps in connection to Perrin first meeting Gaul, but we'll see. The consequence then of this capture not being primarily about Perrin is that a lot of focus shifts to Egwene in this encounter because Valda suspects her of being a channeler. I don't mind this. A lot of people feel like, Perrin and the Whitecloaks have this ongoing connection, this story throughout the series. And that is true. And that is something that is important and should not be underplayed, whereas Egwene has other things that perhaps impact her more coming up. But I love that we got to see some of how Egwene reacts to being captured here. It does foreshadow other moments for her. Ultimately, by the end of this scene, we're going to see why the Whitecloaks are far more interested in Perrin, because Valda has now seen Perrin and his eyes change to look more like a wolf's. That is now giving him a reason to then become obsessed with and focused on Perrin that he didn't have before. We're setting up that crucial relationship between Perrin and the Whitecloaks here. Perrin had a moment here. This is something he's not going to forget, and Valda's not going to forget it, so it sets it up. I wanted to comment on the story that Nynaeve tells Rand about Egwene when she was a girl and had breakbone fever. We know this story from the book because it is how Nynaeve first channeled. Because she was left alone with Egwene and she thought Egwene was going to die, and without realizing it, she channeled to heal her. Here, the story is told without that element because if Nynaeve channeled at that time, she still doesn't realize it. The focus is then shifted to what that moment says about Egwene's refusal to give in to a death sentence, her refusal to drink a tea that would have eased her passage out of this world. On the other hand, I don't think it rules out the idea that Nynaeve might have channeled. She just still doesn't realize it. Maybe she still thinks that moment when she channeled in front of everyone to heal Lan and the others was her first time channeling. And I could see a possibility where when Nynaeve ends up in the White Tower, it is only then that they discover that she has a block, that she can't channel unless angry. And then with that knowledge, they can then go back and realize, oh, she must have been channeling for years without realizing it. And so I think it would be interesting that might be a little seed of that, a little hint to come, and revealing that later on. And I want to end by talking about that final scene where we see Lan in the role of a mourner. Because for some readers, this was a controversial scene as well, because we're certainly not used to seeing Lan display that much emotion in the books. And some people were really bothered by this. So let me explain why I'm not. One of the rituals here is that there's a designated mourner, someone who was chosen to express and release the grief that they all share. Lan is being tapped to take on that role. And we can see that initially he's not letting everything out, right? It takes him a moment or two. But Moraine is looking at him and tears start coming down from her eyes. And I think that is because through the bond, she knows exactly how much grief he feels. And it makes perfect sense for him to have immense grief and guilt and just an overwhelming amount of emotion underneath the surface. I think that's very in keeping for Lan. And then I think he responds to that. And so it starts to build in him. And ultimately, between this feedback between the two of them and the role that he is being asked to play, he lets it out in a big way. Being stone-faced does not mean that you don't have emotions. It just means that he's used to keeping them in check. It's the same with Aes Sedai, right? Aes Sedai are calm, cool, collected. It doesn't mean they don't have intense feelings underneath. They just don't usually display it. It actually helps us understand his character better, right? That he has all of these layers of intense emotion that he generally keeps underneath the surface, so that later on when he's back to seemingly cool on the surface, we'll know what's underneath and we'll know that he is tamping that down in a way that we wouldn't have known if we'd never gotten a scene of him really expressing that. I get though having complicated emotions about an episode like this, which is very well done, but very different. Overall, I did love the episode, and I love it more as I'm rewatching it more. But as always, please let me know your thoughts on these changes in the comments. And I hope you'll subscribe and come back for more. And until next time, keep those loins girded, my friends.